Welcome back. So, we are now going to take forward the argument of forward guidance, that how forward guidance is going to play a really important role in understanding the actions of the central bank, effective communication of the central bank, and how central bank is credible about its forward guidance. So, we will be understanding with the zero lower bound case. So, reference remains same, the Williamson book we are referring, and we have already covered the Mishkin part, and we have also covered the Bank for International Settlement reference and the unconventional monetary policy. So, we will be now going and seeing that how the credibility of the central bank is decided with the help of the forward guidance. So, here it becomes really important to look at. So, here we have the scenarios. So, first let us talk about the liquidity trap due to low real interest rate. Low real interest rate, how we are talking about. So, suppose this is the real interest rate, this axis shows the current output, this axis shows the current inflation rate, and this out. So, the x axis remains same, the y axis is changing for these two charts. So, here what we are seeing is that at R star, which is the equilibrium real rate of interest, you have the output of y m, and it corresponds to, suppose for example, the hypothetical scenario is that I star here, right, this is the rate of interest, but for the time being we assume that. So, this is the inflation rate, we have I 2, but because of the zero lower bound where the nominal interest rate is 0. So, here you have minus I star, and this can also be 0, because if you are thinking about the inflation, because in this model we are not assuming 0, because here we are expecting that the central bank has a control on the nominal interest rate, but it does not have control on the inflationary scenarios. So, it has to follow up. So, whether the nominal interest rate will follow the inflationary scenarios, that we are mentioning. So, that is why here we have the real interest rate negative, right. Now, what we are seeing is that corresponding to this, the inflation rate is much lower, I 1, and it is creating the output gap, which is nothing but y m minus y 1. So, you can think about that with this rate of interest, which is almost like a less which is still there, that we are not able to achieve the equilibrium level of output, which should ideally be R star and the y m, because of the low real interest or almost like a 0 lower bound, we are having, it is having deviation. So, and the inflation rate is also lower. Now, what typically should have happened, that because the nominal interest rate is 0, now in this case the inflation should have picked up, but because of the liquidity trap scenario, where your money supply or money, or I would say demand for money becomes a perfect substitute for the holding of the bond. So, if you are having the 0 interest rate, then it does not matter that whether you are going for demand for money, holding the cash stock, or you are going for holding the bond. So, if you have that kind of scenario, so what typically happens is that in order to attract, so here what we are seeing, that even if the central bank is trying to incorporate certain adjustment with regard to the interest rate. So, interest rate you cannot now change, because it has already touched the low. So, what we are seeing, that there is some kind of permanent deviation happening between the equilibrium level of inflation, which is I 2, and then here we have I 1. So, in this particular case, what typically will happen, that the central bank may take some non-conventional measure and may try to adjust with this middle point, which is I star. So, the liquidity trap situation create a very unfavorable situation, that even if you have the interest rate scenarios, which is the nominal interest rate almost 0, inflation does not pick up, and this is one of the important arguments that Neo-Fisherism or I would say Neo-Fisherian school, they argue that if you are having low level liquidity trap, then, or if you have a 0 lower bound, if you have the low real rate of interest, then it typically happens that individuals will not be caring about the I would say open market operations, and ultimately your demand for money will also not have that much reaction. So, you may have permanent output gap and permanent deviation. So, in order to bring out the differences lower, the central bank has to think about the forward guidance. Under forward guidance, central bank may signal that the rate of interest is going to be higher, and if sorry, the inflation is going to be higher. So, as a result the nominal interest rate is going to be higher. Then in that situation, this inflationary trend may shoot up and reach to I star, otherwise it will not. So, this is the precondition of Neo-Fisherism argument that they mention about fulfilling this, that in what all situations we can come to this point, which is R star and Ym. Now, let us talk about the forward guidance. So, in case of forward guidance, what typically happens that this is the R star and this is the Ym. At this point here you have the I star, right. Now, if you are thinking about the zero lower bound. So, in case of zero lower bound, what typically happens that if this is the point, here we have the I1 transpose and this is corresponding to I1, which is the inflation. So, if you have the equilibrium level of inflation, or I would say target is this, the target I would say real rate of interest is this, the output is this. What we are seeing is that at I1, because of the zero lower bound, the inflation is much lower. We are creating the output gap Y1 and Ym, right. So, difference between these two lines, it is the output gap, because equilibrium should be Ym and R star, the corresponding should be that I star and Ym, right. So, at this particular line we should have this I star, corresponding to this we should have Im, but what we are finding that because of this, the zero lower bound scenario, because of the nominal interest rate being 0, we are creating the output gap which is Yn. So, difference between Ym and Y1 is the output gap. The corresponding to this, the inflation is much lower. Now, this inflation lower, in order to increase this, what central bank is supposed to do? Central bank is supposed to think about how they can make adjustment with regard to the forward guidance. So, if the central bank mentions that the rate of interest is going to be, or the inflation scenario is going to be higher, then your inflation moves to I2, and this will create a scenario for I2 transpose and Y2. So, your output gap which was initially Y1, so Ym minus Y1, now it is reducing because of this inflationary guidance that you are mentioning, that there must be. So, you must be knowing that in the case of Fed Reserve, we always hear on certain interval that Fed Reserve is going to revise the interest rate, which means that it is going to move up from the zero lower bound, which also means that it is, if it is doing 1%, then it is going to be 1.25, 1.50%. There will be a lot of discussion around that stand, that what is going to happen, and then the Fed Reserve decides about that, whether they have to go for increasing or decreasing the rate of interest. So, typically it is not linked with the inflation in the case of most of the advanced economies. It has to deal more, it has to deal with more of the financial market disturbance because of the money supply increase that they expect. But with regard to forward guidance, what economists argue that if you are giving the signaling with regard to the inflation, right, and future rate of interest higher, whether it is inflation or anything you can think about, then it can create a scenario for reducing the output gap, and this will further shift the Phillips curve leftward, and this higher inflation scenario will also fulfill to some extent the Y2 Ym. The Phillips curve, as I have already showed, inverse relationship between the inflation and the unemployment. So, if you have a higher inflation in the economy, then it is bound to be that the unemployment will be lower, right. So, this particular angle leads to shift in the leftward shift in the Phillips curve. So, this is what we have, the I2 transpose. So, forward guidance, what it leads compared to here, in this case there is a wedge, the gap between these two, and this gap is fulfilled, or I would say this gap is filled with the forward guidance scenario. So, this is how they argue with the condition, that in which all context they can think about having this scenario. So, forward guidance, a commitment by the central bank to high future inflation, right, this is what we mentioned. Given fixed anticipated future inflation, because future inflation we have assumed as exogenous, this creates a scenario, it acts to lower the real rate of interest, because you are targeting the nominal interest rate to be 0 almost, right, increase current output and increase current inflation rate. So, this is what we have, that increasing the inflation rate. As a result, your output is still lower than the full employment level of output, but it is increasing because of this expectation about the future inflation, because the labor participants will also be expecting about it, right. Central bank commitment important, it is also that promise needs to be credible, which means that, as I mentioned, that if you are teaching a course and if this course has the content of taking the quiz, regular quiz, and if you are not taking quiz, then in future if you are going to make announcement, then students will not be taking seriously. In the same way, this, if the central bank is going to make announcement about or certain kind of signaling about the higher future inflation, then it means that this has to be accompanied by the higher rate of higher rate of interest, and if that is not met, then forward guidance may not be credible enough in future. So, people will not be taking the, I would say, the directions of the central bank seriously. So, there it becomes really crucial. What we have now is the Neo-Fisherism. So, Fisher has given the idea where we talked about the real interest rate is equal to nominal interest rate minus inflation. In case of rational expectation, we think about expected inflation, right. The Fisher equation mentions about that. Then we are seeing in the case of new Keynesian rational expectations model, that how the NKRE model can play a very important role. So, Neo-Fisherism, first it is important to understand that what do you mean by Neo-Fisherism. The conventional view on central banking suggests that the nominal interest rate target commensurates with the inflation rates, which means that if you have the nominal interest rate higher, you have the higher inflation rate, then only you will be talking about increasing your nominal interest rate. If the nominal interest rate is lower, which imply that the central bank is talking about the lower inflation. The high low inflation implies high low nominal interest rate target, right. This is the conventional setup. A new school Neo-Fisherism, Neo-F, argues that the conventional central bank interest rate operations have been wrong, because if you are keeping the inflation, keeping the nominal interest rate almost at 0 level, your inflation should have the impact on it, should grow by more than 1 percentage basis point or 2 percentage point, not just 1 for 1. So, if your interest rate is 1%, your inflation should be 2%, 3%. So, in the same way as we add with future periods, it should go on, but it is not happening in most of the first world countries, and this has become a major challenge, which means that inflation control is wrong. According to Neo-F, a central banker would decrease the nominal interest rate when inflation is below above the central bank's inflation target. So, this is what we try to always mention about. The central banker would decrease the nominal interest rate when inflation is below above the central bank. So, it is recommending to have the policy stand just opposite to the conventional system, that if you have the interest rate, inflation rate lower, you go for higher interest rate. If inflation rate is higher, you go for a lower interest rate. So, counter cyclical you can think about. Normally we say in case of business cycle, counter cyclical and pro cyclical. During counter cyclical, when economy scenarios are poor, then you go for reducing the interest rate much lower and create a favorable scenario for investment. Here they are recommending that if you are expecting higher inflation, reduce the nominal interest rate. If you are expecting lower inflation, increase the nominal interest rate, and this will in turn will increase the inflationary scenario. So, this is quite controversial and people are still trying to digest this particular idea. So, we will be trying to understand with 1 or 2 examples that how it works. The key Neo-Fisherism principle is that central banks can increase inflation by increasing their nominal interest rate targets, an idea that may seem radical, and then the central bankers typically believe that cutting interest rate increases inflation. Neo-Fisherism argue that inflation targeting would work better if central bankers did not adhere to the Taylor rule. So, output gap and inflation gap that we mentioned with the target in inflation rate, that should not be there, and the central bank should focus only on the inflation and the nominal interest rate target. That is it. They are not recommending to have any kind of output gap. The central bank should adopt their rhetoric to account for the Fisherian inflation dynamics. So, these are the Neo-Fisherism that we talk about. So, Neo-Fisherism comes from the Fisherian idea, where it is also having some kind of bearing on the NKRE model that we are going to see now. So, if you think about the dynamic output demand relationship, so this is the output gap, which is inversely related with 1 upon d r minus I transpose, which is the expected future inflation minus real rate of interest that we have. So, r bar is the real interest rate that we try to mention about. So, what it captures? It captures that if we are going to see in the framework of intertemporal, then it says that the more demand for output in current period relative to future lower the real rate of interest, because if you are thinking about more of the current period expenditure, it means that you think that in future the inflation rate is not going to be higher. So, your real interest rate may also not look if the inflation scenarios are not going to be higher, then you think that your real interest rate will be better, because if inflation is lower, nominal interest rate remains same, then you are going to have the higher real interest rate, which means that here we think about some kind of better demand scenario in future, right. So, this is what it indicates. Now, if you think about this parameter, which is 1 upon d, it shows about the intertemporal elasticity of substitution, which means that how is the real economic agent, whether it is consumer and firm, thinking about current and future period consumption. If you think that the real interest rate scenarios are going to be lower in future, you will be spending more today. If you have real interest rate scenario higher in future, you will save more today. So, it talks about that. The difference between the demand for goods and the future demand for goods depend upon the difference between the real interest rate. So, this is what we have, r minus I bar. The higher real interest rate over the natural rate of interest, this is what the natural rate of interest here we have, implies that demand for future goods is higher, right. So, if you have the then for the goods in the present, so higher, if this is going to be higher, which is about the expected inflation, then people would like to go for more of, they will simply postpone the current consumption, they will save that amount and maybe using that in future. So, dynamic output demand relationship, it mentions about your output gap that we have, it depends upon the relative preference of current to future, and it depends upon the real interest rate and how it is deviating with the natural rate of interest, or I would say natural real rate of interest. So, this is how we mention about. If you think about the Phillips curve, so this is what we have. So, I is equal to a y minus y m, and this we have already assumed in when we are talking about the new Keynesian school. So, what it says, this is also the output gap y minus y m, and a is the parameter and it is positive, right, a is greater than 0. When firms set their prices, they do not do so in forward looking fashion, and they always account the anticipated inflation. The anticipated inflation, since it is exogenous, so what we have is the expected inflation. It depends upon the future output that you are going to have, the future output minus the y m. If you just substitute for y and y m here, right, if you just substitute here y and y bar here, then what we get is this particular part, we just get this part, right. If you are just solving for this future inflation, and if you just solve for I bar here, substitute y and y bar after solving, and then solve for I transpose here, what we get is this particular expression. But from where this is coming? This is coming from the rational expectation. Where it is the rational expectation? Rational expectation in the sense that people are utilizing more and more information about forming the expectation. So, where it will be used? It will be used here. when I am talking about the expectation, this will depend upon how much is the expected future output. So, what is the economic outlook, how is the economy is going to do, whether it will be able to achieve the higher growth scenarios. Based on that, people will be thinking about the inflationary trend. So, that we mentioned about here, right. So, consumers and firm can predict future inflation and output perfectly. So, this is how we cover. Solving the model, future inflation depends upon the current inflation. So, this is how is the future inflation, which is dependent upon the real rate. Here it is the nominal interest rate minus the equilibrium rate of interest. This is what we have upon A plus D, and this I is the current inflation, which is also decided by the D is the preference. So, intertemporal substitution, right, how is the whether the interest rate scenarios are going to be good in the future. If it is going to be good, you save more today, spend more in the future. So, here it determines about. But what typically happens is that in case of future inflation for the central bank, let us think about, let us stop for a moment and think about that for the central bank, what is in the hand of the central bank? It is the nominal rate of interest. What is not in the hand of the central bank is the inflation, because it depends upon the output gap, right, and an output gap is too much to handle for the central bank. So, central bank can decide about the interest rate scenarios and can signal the market about the inflation. So, they may not have exact idea that how this will simply propel in the economy. So, they may recommend that okay, we are thinking about this interest rate scenario, considering that inflation will be this, but they do not have exact idea that how the inflation scenario will be, because it depends upon the expectation of the individuals, right, and individuals may be forming expectations by using the adaptive expectation. So, some proportion may be having the adaptive expectation, they will be giving more weightage to the immediate previous period. Then some people will be forming the expectation based on inputting a lot of indicators. Then in that scenario, if the central bank is alone taking the decision on R, the nominal interest rate, how inflation moves up. So, that is the underlying idea that we will be trying to see. So, indeterminacy problem becomes quite an obvious case here when we talk about the rational expectation and introduce the rational expectation in the case of dynamic output demand relationship, especially when you have the intertemporal substitution taking place about the current and future period consumption. So, there it becomes really important to look at. Now, here what we try to see is that at point A, if the central bank is going to decide about R minus R bar, right, and this is the most equilibrium scenario where the future inflation is equal to the current inflation, perfect foresight you can say. This is the example of perfect foresight. This is the line that talks about this dynamic demand relationship with the future expected inflation. So, here we achieve, right, this particular part. So, if this is what we have, and this is the current inflation and this is the future inflation. So, y axis is showing about the future inflation and x axis shows the current inflation. Then you can think about if the central bank is targeting a higher point, which is having the perfect foresight and the dynamic demand relationship, right, crossing at point equilibrium at point A, you will find that inflation will also move from I0 in the perfect increasing or incremental manner. It will also move up, and it will be going towards a scenario where we are going to talk about that in the period 1 it will move here. In period 2, it can touch to this point, which is I1, which is still not the desired inflation scenario that we have. Further, it moves up, and finally, it will be also having increasing trend. So, what is the idea behind the Neo-Fisherism? That if you have the nominal interest rate constant, which is if I am the central bank, if I am going to fix the nominal interest rate higher, right. So, here it is A point, and A point also is you can think about some kind of steady equilibrium that we always talk about in case of the solo growth model, which is about the inflation, investment and the depreciation rate, right. So, here we have point A. Now, A shows about r minus r bar, and here we have r minus r bar. So, if this is rate is going to be the constant, what we see is that inflation also hovers around and it moves up. So, it depends upon the central bank what is the target of the nominal interest rate. If the nominal interest rate target is higher, and even if it is constant for longer period, you see that there will be some kind of upward movement, and this will be primarily derived by the notion that we have about the intertemporal substitution. People will be substituting for current and future period consumption, making adjustment with this regard. And what is more crucial is about the A plus D. So, A is coming from Phillips curve and D is coming from the rate of substitution, right, about the current and future period consumption, which is directly linked with the inflationary scenario. So, this is how it looks like, right. Now, we talk about the long run Fisher relationship. In long run Fisher relationship, what is the basic premise? Here we assume that the future expected inflation is equivalent to the current inflation. So, if future expected inflation is going to be equivalent to the current inflation, I transpose equal to I, then in that case your the steady state or long run relationship, it says that in the long run what we have seen about the discretion. So, in the beginning we mentioned about discretion, we mentioned about certain rules, time inconsistency problem that we are going to see here. In the long run, because of the short run decisions, how long run is going to be impacted. So, in the long run what we assume that we have the expected inflation I transpose equal to I, then in that case your current inflation becomes your R minus the targeted real rate of interest. This is what we have. Now, so long run inflation is determined by the nominal interest rate. This is what we have. Inflation rises 1 for 1 in the long run with R, which means that if the current inflation increasing by 1%, same way we can think about the monetary phenomena, that if you have the nominal interest rate increasing by 1%, this will also lead to increase in the inflation by 1% only. So, this is how it mentions about. So, your inflation in actuality in the long run is nothing but is the difference between the nominal interest rate minus the equilibrium real rate of interest. So, this is what we try to understand here, that if your expectations about the future inflation, it is equivalent to T, which we are having the perfect foresight example. I am talking about long run. In the long run, the inflation becomes the spread between the nominal interest rate and the equilibrium real rate of interest. If these two are having no difference, then your inflation is almost going to be 0. If you have the nominal interest rate higher than the real interest rate, then whatever is the difference, that will be taking into account the I part. So, this is how we try to link it. We also see in the short run scenario that how increase in the nominal interest rate will be moving. Suppose if you have point A, steady state, we move to point B. So, from D1 to D2, because of the increase in nominal interest rate, we see that inflation also follows I1, I2, I3, it goes up, right, and it touches, right. So, in the same way we see that there is some kind of incentive for the central bank to have the forward guidance scenario and have the higher nominal interest rate target, so that inflation will also follow, and inflation follows that by taking into account the intertemporal substitution between current and future consumption. So, what is the result? Result is that in the long run inflation increases 1 for 1 with an increase in the nominal interest rate. If the central bank wants to inflation rate to go up, it needs to increase the nominal interest rate even in the short run, and this is the second finding that we have, the Neo-Fisherian result. Even in the short run, if the nominal interest rate goes up, inflation goes up. So, this is what they mention about. If you are moving from A to B, you find that in the non-determinacy manner the inflation will be moving. But if you ask me that what is the underlying idea behind doing this analysis, the underlying idea behind doing this analysis is that for the central bank it is easier to have the to decide about the nominal interest rate based on certain expectations about inflation, but on inflation they do not have any control. So, the only thing is that they can play with this. So, let us keep the higher interest rate up and then people will be having some kind of preference about current and future. So, if you are keeping the nominal interest rate higher, people will be thinking that let us save today and have more in future. So, this will create a scenario for the long run, and in the long run one major finding that we have, that in the long run your inflation is nothing but the difference between the nominal interest rate minus the equilibrium real interest rate. The larger is the spread, larger is the inflation. If the smaller is the spread, then smaller is the inflation. So, in the long term scenario, the central bank always react in the same way. So, I hope with this I will be completing this session, and I hope it has given you a complete idea about. So, let me summarize what we have done so far. So, we started with the time inconsistency problem, right. Then we had the argument of monetary policy rule, the constant money growth rate we introduced. Then we also introduced the Taylor rule I would say scenario. Then we added the dimension of the credibility of the central bank with nominal anchor. We also added some kind of dimension that what should be the objective of the central bank, so inflation targeting. Then we also added the dimension of the central bank independence, what should be the outlook of the central banker, whether he should be conservative or hawkish on inflation. So, we talked about that. Then we moved to the Neo-Keynesian school, started thinking about the zero lower bound scenario, that how we can determine the output gap and how the targeted interest rate can play important role. What are the roles or what is the amount of adjustment that central bank make to narrow down the output gap. So, then we introduced the concept of Phillips curve in detail, and then we move to the topic when we introduce the forward guidance scenario, that in which all scenario the central bank can push up the inflation, and if they are targeting the higher or if you are operating under the zero lower bound. Then we move to the forward guidance, then we move to the long term equilibrium, that how we can decide about. What we found that the intertemporal substitution matters a lot, and then we finally ended up with the Neo-Fisherism idea that there should be inverse relationship between inflation and the nominal interest rate. If inflation is higher, your nominal interest rate should be lower, and they try to prove it with the help of the dynamic demand relationship in the intertemporal context. So, I hope you have understood the idea. Refer the book of Mishkin and I would say the Williamson. These two books will be helpful to add the dimension further. I am stopping it here. Thank you so much for your attention.